The progress of devolution in Parliament was blocked, not by the government, who installed a three-line whip, but by rebel backbenchers. Some of the fiercest opposition came from Scottish Labour MPs. Their unofficial leader was indeed a Scot, but one with a London seat. His opposition was in part based on what he saw as his own party's cynicism.
It's unbalanced. It can't last.
There were some people who could make a case that a Parliament for Scotland would improve the governance of Scotland. But the vast majority of those who were pushing the proposal were pushing it because they wanted to dish the SNP. And this was a means which they thought would achieve that.
In March 1976, Harold Wilson announced his resignation. He was replaced by Jim Callaghan. Some believe that neither one of these Labour leaders ever had any intention of delivering on the promise of devolution.
I don't think either Harold Wilson or Jim Callaghan were naturally devolvers, but they saw that there was an upsurge of demand for more powers in Scotland. The SNP were at that stage being successful in Scotland. So there was a huge amount of cynicism about it, and it was really how do we address the nationalist issue in many of their minds, and not a matter of what do we want, what is the best way of governing the United Kingdom.
Both leaders were well aware of the long-term political and economic risks associated with devolution. It could cost Labour seats in Scotland, and it could reignite the issue over ownership of the oil. The whole devolution debate took on an increasingly surreal atmosphere. The government whips attacked the rebels, who continued to block the legislation. But they believed their position was strengthened by the lack of commitment at the very top.
The form of the opposition took was that for 47 days we kept the House of Commons going. Now, it's all very well for James Callaghan to criticise me for doing this in his memoirs, but the truth of the matter is that Jim was perfectly happy as Prime Minister to see us chuntering away on the floor of the House. On several occasions, I said, Jim, as a senior member of the Cabinet, can I talk to you about the Scottish situation and this argument for a Scottish Assembly? Don't bother me with that. Tell me what the party is thinking about Cyprus. He told me on one famous occasion. He simply didn't want to discuss it.
In January 1978, this combination of government ambivalence and rebel opposition culminated in an event now known as the Burns Night Massacre.
We were told that overwhelmingly Scotland wanted the creation of this Parliament in this form. Now, therefore we were entitled to say, right, let's test that.
Cunningham tabled an amendment to the Act which dictated that in the referendum for a Scottish Assembly, at least 40% of the electorate had to turn out and vote in favour. Any less than that would lead to the legislation being repealed.
What's right and what is wrong by the law?
Well, that was a device to prevent the Assembly happening, basically.
40% is a very reasonable figure to obtain, and if there is not the 40% for it, then the claims made by the supporters of devolution turn out to be wrong, and that's what we were saying.
I wanted to walk down the room that I was in Westminster and choke George Cunningham to death.
Well, there was a great deal of viciousness in the opposition, and that started when I tabled my amendment. And it was interesting because people had been saying there is this overwhelming majority, so why should they be afraid of my amendment? If there was an overwhelming majority, my amendment would not have stopped it going ahead. So they were vicious because a stick had been put in the juggernaut's wheel.